I was one of many in my generation who had serious questions about our military involvement around the world, and it's active politically and speaking up about whether we should be in the war and what our role was in the world. And I was going to school, and then I was drafted, and so I ended up in the Army. So I kind of got on both sides of that story, and I served in the Army, and that's how I ended up, like many at my generation who ended up serving in the war. Get your notice from the Selective Service Board that you're drafted, and you go through a process. You go through a physical and an exam and the like. And through this period, you're also kind of wondering, so what am I doing and why am I doing this? And you have to kind of think through, or at least I did, have to kind of think through, so how do you proceed? Ironically, it was a crazy time in many ways. And when, before I was drafted, I wanted to become a pilot. And so I thought of, well, I'll join the Air National Guard here and stuff. And so I signed up for the Air National Guard, but I didn't make it through the physical for the Air National Guard. Now, when I got drafted for the Army, my physical was just fine. So I guess they needed infantry more than they did pilots. But I just say that is that many people, and I could speak for myself, but I also know many people who were kind of sorting through in their life, now what do they do? How do they proceed with their life? Because all of a sudden, your life as a young adult and how you fit in the world, somebody else just yanked control over that away from you. And anyways, so that's how I had gotten involved in the military in the first place. Then they shipped me out to Fort Lewis, Washington for basic training, and then advanced infantry training, AIT, and went through that process out there. And then I came home, got married, and went down to Texas, Fort Hood, Texas, and served in the 2nd Armored Division there, in the Army. It was a rapid deployment unit. We were a unit that is supposed to be able to be dropped in 24 hours anywhere in the world. And so that was our training and mission, is that we would do exercises and stuff. And the other things that we did is we were an armored and a mechanized infantry unit. And I was a machine gunner and an armored personnel carrier. And what we did besides training and exercises is we tested equipment for Vietnam, equipment that was being designed for, we'd field test the equipment and the new explosives and materials that were being developed for the war. And then I was, well, my whole unit mostly were Minnesota, from Minnesota, and people who I had gone to basic training and advanced infantry training with me out in Fort Lewis, and then we're down in our unit in Texas, all got orders to Vietnam, and everybody processed out of the unit. And but when they give you your orders, then they follow up later with your travel orders. And my travel orders got delayed for a reason I have no idea, other than good fortune. But they got delayed, and so then I was in a unit with no reason. I didn't exist in that unit, and and they didn't have records for me. So I would come in every day and to the fort, and they would have me check in, and then say, well, you got to stay in the fort for the day, but we don't know what to do with you because you're not in our unit, and we don't have orders for you to go anywhere. So that's what I did for a period of time. And then there was a need for a unit to go to, as I say, we were a rapid deployment unit, and there was a unit to go in to serve with NATO in Europe. And one day I'm in formation, the 3rd Corps commander comes walking through. You, report to this other company. Okay, report to the other company. You're getting on a plane. You're going to Europe. That's where I ended up in my deployment.
Where did you end up?
It was actually in England. We were doing it was a joint deployment with the Royal Highland Fusiliers. It's actually the Queen's unit in England. So what we were being trained on is, because we were mechanized and armored unit, when they would do rapid deployment of our unit, they would drop us in with our gear, our weapons and our gear, but they would have pre-positioned the equipment, the tanks and the armored personnel carriers and stuff. So they were deploying us because some of the equipment that was in Europe was actually British made or made in other countries. And so they brought us in to work with the other, in this case, the British military, to gain proficiency in their equipment. So when we were dropped in, we could operate it proficiently. So that's what that was our role over there. It was actually a great experience because, first of all, we got to meet the other units and spend time. We were living with them, housed with them, and out there in the field with them. And also, to be perfectly honest, military equipment is kind of interesting stuff. I mean, when you're working with tanks and explosives, and I was a machine gunner, keep in mind what this equipment really is and the potential of it, and safety being a prime concern, because you're setting explosives, detonating very powerful explosives, using weapons that are high capability to do damage and injury. And so you are, on one hand, it's very interesting and obviously not something that most people deal with on a regular basis. It's out of the norm, to say the least. And so it's interesting, but it's also one that you just have to be constantly aware of what the danger is. Anyways, it's interesting, and was interesting spending the time over there. Well, I had actually been an ROTC before I went in. I was a Cretan graduate, but really, to me, it's more of a question on the military, is that it is so foreign to what most people in their life know. And the question is always, what is happening tomorrow? Because you are full-time military, an active military unit, and with our, saying with the going to Vietnam, as I'll train for Vietnam, orders, processed out. You turn in all your equipment. You get your gear, your jungle gear. My wife quits her job. You pack everything in your vehicle, and you're headed off to war. She's headed back home. The next day they said, no, that's not what you're doing. You're going here. And then from there, one of the things that in our training with our unit, because we were this rapid deployment unit, you'd board on a plane one day, and your weapons, your supplies, and all this stuff, you get on a plane. You didn't know whether this was just a training exercise, and you'd fly off. I mean, you'd go flying off, and you're kind of like, so where are we going, and why, and where are we being dropped into? And luckily, did not have a problem there, but that's always in the back of your mind. And when we were deployed to Europe, we didn't know what the next piece was. We didn't know, so now are you moved to a forward position? Is there something going on? Because people forget the Cold War that was going on and the danger there. And that you, in the military, you don't know where you're going the next day. And so you're there, and this is interesting. It's interesting to see, interesting to learn this. But so when does the other shoe drop? That's just and I don't mean to make too much of it, but it is, you just never know what you're doing. And you also, in the training, it's another one of those things about the seriousness of the training, is you realize that that your ability to learn, how to use certain explosives, how to use certain weapons and stuff, isn't just an exercise. It's not like going to school and you care about what grade you get. This may, tomorrow, be a life and death issue for you and the people around you, depending on what you know. So there's just it's a very odd and very serious, but it's particularly Vietnam was in this context of this almost surreal world because the country was very divided. People were unsure why we were going there. It was unclear what a victory would be if there ever was a victory. And you're just kind of thrown in with thousands of other people in varying but similar situations. Why are we here, and what are we doing, and what is tomorrow bringing us? I'm very fortunate. I'm alive, I'm well. I've got a wife who served with me, still with me today. I'm very blessed. And I see so many of the people that I served with, and I know, and I watch the impact that it's had on their lives. And people truly do not understand if they're in the service, and that's not a criticism of anybody else. You just can't. It would be very difficult for others to understand the multitude of impacts on people's lives, and that they suffer with all their life. They struggle through, and many do very well, some not so well. But it takes a heavy toll on them, and that's why one of the reasons why I spend a fair amount of time trying to advocate for resources for veterans, particularly disabled veterans, because they did pay this very high price for serving their country. And I firmly believe that the resources that they were promised when they were in the service should be there for them today. And so it's one of the things that I work on, and it's just very, very important, because I work with individuals and advocate broadly for the programs. But with individuals, and when you see it just in the human, people you know closely and some not so closely, but you watch them individually in their lives, and you see how in many layers how this impacts their lives. It's destroyed relationships they've had. It's created physical disabilities or handicaps or issues that then play out also in their inability to earn a decent living, inability to do the things they'd like to go, and particularly the draftees, but even the rest of them. It wasn't necessarily their choice to do so. They served, but it wasn't. They were asked to do it, and they did it, and probably so. But they really need to see those the care be there today, and the programs there to make sure that they do have housing in it. As I say, it's painful to watch because you see really catastrophic impacts, just human impacts that are there, and you can relate, at least on the level that you have seen this in individuals, and you see how it happened, how it came along with what it did. Down in Fort Hood, how they cycled through to Vietnam, one of the things that they did is that you'd go over and serve a year, and then you'd come back, and a lot of them had a few months or 6 months or so back. And so you'd be brought back, and then you'd be placed in a unit here. Okay, you're back from there. You've had very little time, very little transition. The injuries and deaths of people who had survived, fellow service members who had survived the war but came back here, whether it be drugs, car accidents, drinking. I mean, it was so predictable. It wasn't, it was just and so it wasn't every day, but on all too common. So where's Joe? The fancy new 442 he bought, or whatever the car, had piled it up into a tree or an accident and stuff. These were not car accidents. They were fatalities from the war is what they really were. And and so it was, as I say, I wish I could articulate it better, but you also think about the people who are headed to Vietnam are shoulder to shoulder with those who have returned, and they're watching the impacts of this. And soon they will be there, and soon they will be the one in that role. And the cycle just was going on, and the trauma, it's from basic training to AIT, the injuries, just the injuries in training. People don't hear how many people get injured just in day-to-day training. Big calamities, if a plane drops out of the sky, there'll be news reports. But daily, again, at least it seemed daily, there were people getting injured, some very severely, some fatally in this. And so it was a very consequential, for lack, occupation, if you could call it that. And again, you're isolated from the rest of the world in a large way. And so you're connected with those you're with, and you really do see the progression of how this impact and the events keep piling on to your fellow members of the service. And we used to, while we were in AIT, used to when we could, when we get time, if we got a 3-day or something pass, we would get in the vehicle and drive back to Minnesota 17 hours straight through. This is before freeways. We just drove through. And I can remember one of the storms, they would get freezing ice down there in Texas and Oklahoma. And we got, and they'd close, they'd close the highways and stuff. It was just clear ice. We'd just drive through. And we'd been able to talk the highway patrols have closed the freeway. Alas, we're just going to go up a little further when we get all the way back and stuff. We survived that, but I say that it's just the little things that when all this is going on around, partially you're young and stuff, and you do things that you probably shouldn't do, or you're foolish, but the ability to escape, even if it's for a few days, to get away, is very powerful, and you'll go to great lengths to do so. As I say, I have no complaints at all. I'm very fortunate, very lucky, but I look at how this has impacted so much of, not people I know, but as our country, and how this has evolved into the lives, but also the decisions and the policies and stuff, and how this country, and we, at least my generation, growing up in 50s and 60s, is following World War II. And the economy really picked up, and with World War II being the second war that it's going to be the war of end all wars, World War One was, and that is there really was a strong belief that we're not going to be sending the youth of our country back into a war, and there's going to be an economy, and people are concerned about the environment. There was when we were growing up, there was a real belief that the possibilities were huge, and it really was going to be, it was our hope, but also I think our parents' hope for us, that we had this really great future ahead of us. And so the Vietnam War, the amount of people that were impacted in it, the amount of people that were involved in it, how it dampened because of the financial cost of the war, how it impacted the economy and the possibilities as a nation to do other things. I think it's just impossible to understate the impact that it had on our generation.